Okay, now we're going to dive into the actual countries that try to use absolutism. The two countries that we'll be looking at is France first and then Britain. There's various other states that also try this. For example, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. But I'm not going to go into every single state that tried this. Some of this is detailed online as well as in the textbook. So I'm going to focus on the two major power players at this period of time, but also have vastly different consequences based on absolutism. So with that, let's start with France itself. Alright, so France starts off this century of 1600 with King Louis XIII. And his reign is going to last from 1610 to 1643. He actually becomes king at age 8, and that is because his father, Henry IV, is going to be assassinated. Now, the French weren't stupid. They didn't want an 8-year-old running around running the kingdom. They wanted someone with some experience, and so they employ a regent. A regent is somebody who acts for the king in his stead until he's, or she, it happens in both cases, will be able to assume control. So typically this is going to be until they reach the age of 18, but the king or queen can decide whether or not that they take control at the age of 18. Some monarchs are, some aren't, entirely dependent on the individual. So the regent who is actually going to take control is actually going to be Maria de Medici. She is from the very famous Italian family, the Medici family, that has a lot of power in Italy, and through a marriage alliance, she made it to France. And so she would rule in King Louis XIII's stead. Now, what was happening while she was running the country were many nobles and barons were trying to basically woo and manipulate her, either trying to marry her so power would go to the male in this case. And so that arose a very interesting problem that certainly the French royalty didn't want to happen. So what happened was they found this guy called Cardinal Richelieu. And Cardinal Richelieu, he would have this job from 1585 to 1642. His job was essentially to grow the power of the royalty. He was not a noble, he was an independent individual, and so he was loyal to the king. He didn't really have any titles or any sort of lineage that would tie him to any of the nobles in France. So he really was the right guy for the job. So what he decides to do is, first, the objective is to grow the power of the royal power and decrease the power of the nobility. So how he did this was he at first started at the local level. He started restricting the power of some of the local assemblies like city councils, but also some regional courts where you would go for lawsuits, or if you wanted to sue somebody, they would get their power through the crown. So if they wanted these courts to be open or the right to assemble, they would first have to, for example, pay the king a fee. This brought them to be more dependent on the French monarchy than, say, the nobles, because they didn't have that power. So that was the first stage. This is basically breaking apart the nobility and their power a little bit. What Cardinal Richelieu also does is he creates a position that are called intendants. This is a French word. These are basically individuals who don't have any ties to the nobility. They are professionals, they are educated, they are trained, and their job basically, one, to be loyal to the crown, of course, but to collect taxes, provide advice or counsel to local administration, and then finally to recruit soldiers for the army. This guy is going to be completely separate from the nobility, so that is going to be certainly very valuable for King Louis XIII, as well as Cardinal Richelieu. Speaking of tax collection, the nobles themselves are actually exempt from taxes. So that's a huge amount of funds that the French state does not have control over. And this is a typical practice going back all the way to the ancient period, where nobility typically does not have taxes. So what Cardinal Richelieu did was, instead of taxing the individual, so for example, you would tax John Doe or Jane Doe. You're taxing the individual person. What Cardinal Richelieu does is he changes it to taxing the land itself. So you get away from the restriction on the nobility, because you're not directing the tax at the nobility, you're directing the tax at the land. It's a nice little clever way to get some funds in the coffers of the French government. Now, all this is very effective. The intendants bring in more taxes because the nobility isn't skimming some of those funds when they collect it, which was traditionally how tax collection was done previously. So more money is coming to the coffers because there's more efficient tax collection. The books are kept up to date, but also you're taxing more land. Despite this, there isn't enough money for the French government, and this is in part to some of the issues, for example, warfare and keeping that full-time army supplied and trained. It's very expensive, as I've mentioned before, and so they are not able to get enough money to pay for all of these. So France continues to go into debt, and this is what's going to happen to many states at this time as well. Unfortunately, Cardinal Richelieu, of course, is going to die. Now, remember, I mentioned that he would live till 1642. At 1642, we're going to have another individual, Jules Mazarin. He is alive from 1602 to 1661. He basically replaces Cardinal Richelieu with his job upon that date, 1648. But once he obtains the power, there's a civil war. Basically, the Parliament and later the nobility are tired of being pushed around. So what happens first is Parliament. This is going to happen in 1648. Basically, what the royalty decided to do was to basically declare that Parliament and all its members need to surrender 4 years of their salary and give it over to the monarchy. Of course, they don't much care for that, which is completely understandable. So they refuse. And they also call on limits to royal authority. So we're talking about laws or in potential rebellion against the royalty to limit their power to come to some sort of agreement. Of course, King Louis XIII does not care for that, and what ensues is a civil war. King Louis XIII and his family moves away from Paris for the duration of this year. So this initially, on the Front de Parlement, is going to be a war with Parliament and the royal powers. But from 1650 to 1653 is going to be the Front de Princes. Basically, Prince de Condé is going to be the prince that is in charge of this movement. He is going to bring about several princes to fight for their cause. They're going to go to Spain and have some alliance systems there as well. King Louis XIII is going to continue this civil war, and eventually Prince de Condé is going to be defeated, and upon his death, the rebellion ceases to exist. So France is experiencing some problems and some resistance to royal power being expanded. But due to the military arm, they're able to quiet these disagreements through force. Alright. The next individual we'll come to is King Louis XIV. He's going to live from 1643 to 1715. And when he comes to power, he is going to have direct control over the government after Marzan's death, which is in 1661. So he allowed basically Marzan to be a regent. He got to have a lot of fun, but then eventually he wanted to take complete control. One of the first things he does is he organizes the construction of the Versailles Palace, a very famous building. In recent history, we've typically used it for peace treaties in Paris, most notably World War II as well as World War I. But during this period of time, this was his estate. This was a little bit a ways from Paris, so they didn't have to deal with the noise and the stench of the city. And basically, the monarchy would stay there, they would live there, and all the nobles and anyone else who was involved in government would come to the Palace of Versailles. The Palace of Versailles actually was a symbol of King Louis XIV's power. He knew that if he could make it as big as humanly possible, that was going to convey that he had quite a bit of power. So, what did he do with this palace now that it's constructed? And it is going to take quite some time to construct this completely. But when it is finally constructed, he's going to require the nobles to spend their time at Versailles, be involved at Versailles. Now, at Versailles, they would have games. They would play tennis, and various other different outdoor activities that you could potentially think of. But they'd also run the government there, too. And he would ask all the nobles to come in from time to time to visit with him and talk with him, have lunch or dinner with him. What this did was it brought the nobles away from governmental affairs outside of Versailles, so he could keep an eye on them, but also kept them out of potential trouble or conflict. This was a way to potentially prevent a civil war. So, what he would also do is he would ask them advice. What do you think we should do about taxes? Should we raise a bigger army? Should we have road construction? So on and so forth. He would ask this question knowing that he really didn't much care for what they were going to say, but it made the nobles actually feel like they had some power and they were involved in government. As long as the nobles thought they were involved and had control in the government, then they weren't going to conflict with the king. And you would hand out wealth and titles to basically keep their silence as well and bring loyalty to himself, the monarchy. That's what he did with the nobles. It was a nice mirrors and smoke effect, but it worked. He's going to recruit actual working governmental officials from the mercantile class or the merchant class or educated professional classes. These are groups of people who don't have any connection with nobles or past monarchs, any groups like that. So they're going to gain all of their money, wealth, and status from being loyal to the king, King Louis XIV in this case. He's also going to create some departments, and he's going to assign these people as department heads. What I mean by departments is, for example, in our own government, we have a Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, Transportation, the Defense Department, so on and so forth. There's numerous departments out there. And he created these departments because he doesn't want to look into every single aspect of the state. That's going to be very time consuming. Essentially means you're never going to sleep. So he's going to have people look into the defense or labor or commerce and so on and so forth, and then come back to him, tell him what the situation is, and then he can make a decision. So very similar to what we have in a way in the United States, and many other different cultures around the world use this as well. Reason being, it works. Alright, one of the more important aspects and appointments that King Louis XIV is going to make is going to be Jean-Baptiste Colbert. He was alive from 1619 to 1683. Basically, King Louis XIV is going to give him the title of Controller General of the realm. Basically, his job was to manage the economy and supervise the taxes as well as collection of taxes. A very important job. The reason being is King Louis XIV wants to grow the economy, bring more money into the system, so then they can have certainly a balanced budget. At least that's the goal. Around this time, there's this concept of mercantilism. Now, what mercantilism is the belief that the wealth of the state is dependent on the ability to import fewer goods than is exported. The belief at the time is if a state has more resources, they're going to be able to weather any sort of storm out there. That could be invading armies, it could be a famine, it could be disease, it could be a climate change where there's a drought, or even the complete opposite of flood. So if you have more people, more gold, more silver, iron, gunpowder, wood, any sort of resource out there, then you're going to be able to survive much better than maybe the other countries in Europe or around the world. This is going to encourage certainly the French, but also many of the other European powers. The French aren't the only ones who actually believe in this. The British are going to believe in the system, the French, the German states, the Austrians, Portuguese, the Spanish, and so on and so forth. So if you want to explain, for example, colonization, look at this economic model. How you get those resources and secure those resources is you go abroad and you start producing colonies, settlements, and then you start stationing troops to protect that resource so the British or some other group doesn't take it from you. So that's a big reason why you see a lot of European powers in North America, South America, eventually Africa, and as well as Asia. So keep that in mind. So how is he going to revitalize the economy? How he's going to do that is he is going to basically copy what the British are doing at this time. The British have a gigantic fleet, and so they're able to bring in resources from all over the world very quickly and efficiently. So what the French decided to do is also increase their merchant fleet. They start building ships, start building companies, trading companies, very similar to what the British had. For example, in India, they have the East India Company. The French are going to produce a company very much like it to basically organize the obtaining of resources and bringing it back to France. He is also going to implement tariffs. A tariff is a tax on a foreign good. So, for example, if you have bread made in France and bread made in Britain, you're going to tax the bread from Britain to hopefully convince people to buy local bread, French bread, which will then, of course, as a result, increase the economy in France. He also is going to revitalize the infrastructure, building roads and canals all throughout France, starting from Paris, then branching out to the borders. They are also going to encourage textile industries, clothing. This idea wasn't necessarily the greatest of ideas. The British dominated this market, and the French were trying to beat them at their own game. They really weren't going to do very good. The British had the system down, and the French were just not able to compete against it. The French do increase textile, basically clothing industries, increase their output, increase supply, but the British just have so much goods coming in to support that industry, it's always going to be cheaper, and more French people are going to buy British goods rather than French goods. So it really is a catastrophic failure for the French, but the attempt is still made. But finally, he is going to end internal tolls. So just think if you had to pay a toll every single town you drove through. That's essentially what you had in France at this period of time. So if you were taking your wheat supply to sell to the market to be made into bread, you would have to pay a tax every single town you crossed. So by the time you actually made it back home, you might actually not have made that much money off of your crop, and in fact, maybe you would actually be hurting through the process. So eliminating these internal tolls really did boost the French economy by and large. Okay. So that pretty much settles the political structure, the economic structure of France during this day. As far as religion is concerned, France is going to be mainly Catholic, which it historically has been and still is. In 1598, he is going to sign an edict allowing the French to practice Calvinism without being persecuted. So there is some religious freedom there. But eventually that's going to come to an end in a later century. So in France, you really don't have the religious freedom that you have, for example, today in France or Britain or the United States. But there are concessions being made during this period of time. Basically, if they were allowed to practice, they could be used for the economy or the military. So that's one moment of good for King Louis XIV there. Alright. What we dive into next is the wars and bringing the French section to a close. Under King Louis XIV, you're going to see 100,000 soldiers at peace, at peacetime. Once France goes to war, and they are going to go to war several times, once they hit wartime production, you're going to see 400,000 soldiers. So you can see that the number pretty much quadruples. That's going to be very costly. And this is the reason why these changes in taxes really don't help the French economy, because King Louis XIV is constantly going to war. He wants to expand royal authority and power in Europe, and he wants to show all the Europeans that he's basically the big kid on the block, someone to be respected. So he's going to go to war 4 separate times during his reign. And the first one is the War of 1667 to 1668. This is the French against the British, the Dutch, and the Swedes. He is going to be invading north towards basically Dutch territory. There is a series of battles, and the French win this war by gaining a few towns. Essentially, everyone got tired of this war, and so they put a stop to it. Then in 1672, you have another war lasting until 1678, so really not going too much further. Less than a decade, there's going to be another war. This is going to be a war with France against Brandenburg, which is in the German territory. You have Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, which is also in the German territory, reaching down towards Italy. This war is going to be fought more towards the east, where the Holy Roman Empire is. They are going to receive the French Comté, which of course is going to be the eastern section of France. Once again, each of these groups gets tired of the conflict, the warfare, and so they bring it to a peace in 1678. And then finally, the War of 1689, just shy of a decade later, France is going to go to war with the Holy Roman Empire, the United Provinces, which is the Netherlands, Sweden, and England. The opposing force against France is actually going to be called the League of Augsburg. They did not want France to expand any further. They had fought several wars with them already in the last decades. So, in fact, France is going to lose all the territory it gained in the war. They had quite a bit of success at the beginning, but then it just became a disaster. They lose basically all their possessions that they had gained during the war. After the war, France is going to experience quite a bit of famine, and what would follow is an economic depression. So, not really looking good for France. But then the last war, the War of Spanish Succession, which is going to last from 1702 to 1713. Spain, their monarch, is not going to have an heir, and so through a marriage connection as well as a will, he is going to give the Spanish crown to France. The problem with this is, in fact, France and Spain are going to basically control half of Europe, and the European powers don't really care for that. They produce this concept of balance of power, where if one group gets too powerful, the rest of the European powers are going to group together to check the power of that individual. In this case, it's going to be King Louis XIV. This has happened before again. For example, World War I and World War II. So this does happen from time to time. So you're going to have France and Spain against England, the United Provinces, which once again is the Netherlands, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire. The war does not go well for France. They're able to hold their own at the beginning, but eventually they start losing men and territory, and eventually they're going to sign the peace treaty in 1713. What this peace treaty does is it separates France and Spain into separate monarchies, so it breaks that linkage or lineage, however way you want to look at it, and France is going to lose all of its American colonies. So now from 1713 onward, England is going to have complete dominance and control over North America, including Canada, Quebec, and then of course the 13 colonies that are developing in that region. So, what France is left with after these series of wars, and if you were keeping track, basically every single decade that King Louis XIV was in power, there was a war. And so what that left after his reign, certainly after this last war, was France is going to be in debt. They lost a lot of money, they had to pay some reparations for the war, and so they're in vast debt, and all the taxation of the nobles really isn't going to bring about enough finances to actually pay this off. And then they've effectively pissed off everyone around them, so they're surrounded by enemies. So, to end this, we're talking about absolutism, and France certainly is successful in creating an absolute state. You did have one individual who had complete power, and those individuals are going to change from time to time. For example, you had Cardinal Richelieu, who had complete power, and then you had Mazarin, who had complete power, and then King Louis XIV is going to assume power there. So in each one of these cases, and it's not always the monarch, but there is going to be one individual who actually has complete control. So they are successful in bringing absolutism to France. So you can chalk this up as being successful. Does it do France any good? Not really. They basically perform very much like many other states around the world, even if they have absolute state or any other form of government. So, Typically what was going on, certainly in the Middle Ages, is they expanded power, they tried to gain more territory, more land, more wealth. They drove their countries into debt, and there was pretty consistent war between all these different groups. What you see here with the absolute state is that hasn't changed too much. So the question of, does it actually maintain some sort of order that, for example, Thomas Hobbes was afraid of? Hard to say. It does bring a little bit of stability, but there still is a lot of warfare, and everything can be easily upset by a foreign power or internal rebellion. And internal rebellion does happen. So does it solve these problems? Not really. But it does bring in France having a very powerful monarch, and that is going to stay in place for quite some time, certainly until the French Revolution of 1798 or 1789. Sorry, is when it first starts their civil stages. So this does bring about certainly the nation of France, the state of France, and a very powerful monarchy that is going to stay in play for quite some time. So with that, that's France in a nutshell during this period of time.